Hey guys, this is going to be my first strength-focused weak point training, and this video is going to be all about the deadlift. So we'll be touching on the bench and the squat, but that'll be coming a bit later. First off, we really just have to look at our form, because as always, if our form isn't on, if our form isn't good, then we need to tackle those form issues before we can really get to weak point training. Because what you could consider to be a weak point may just be a form issue, whereas if you had a certain cue in your mind, if you did something a bit better, you wouldn't be having that issue at all. Now, first off, let's look at weaknesses from off the floor, right? And so there are a couple things we need to touch on first, which are almost a bit form related, and that is one, breathing and bracing. So if you are breathing and bracing hard off the floor, that's going to affect the amount of tension you can get. And that's going to make the initial pull quite a bit harder. And then also leg drive. If we aren't getting a lot of quad drive just straight into the ground, that's really going to affect the first portion of the lift, and it's going to feel a lot harder. Now, one thing that can help weakness off the floor would be something like speed pulls. And so we're looking at things like bands, things that make the initial part of the movement harder, right? Because we want to get better at the initial part of the movement. And that's where we have our weakness, and so that's where we want to focus on, right? So something like bands helps because it makes us like put more force into the bar, because we need to accelerate through the movement. Because if you get slow with bands, the bands are just going to pull you down more and more. One thing is, if you're doing touch and go reps, switch to dead stop reps, because touch and go reps help us bounce the weight off the floor a little bit, and so that just helps us get past the first initial part of the movement. Whereas if we're doing dead stop reps, if we're stopping on the ground, resetting, we have to pull through that first phase of the lift every single time. Pause deadlifts will also help, but these are pause deadlifts that are just like an inch or two off the floor, and that's just going to help us. It's going to help us stay tight throughout the movement. If we don't have correct form when we're pausing, the lift is pretty much going to go to shit. So pause deadlifts are great because they really reinforce correct technique and correct bracing, correct leg drive, things of that nature. I would say deficit deadlifts also help, because obviously we're in a longer range of motion, and if you're struggling off the floor, if you even go lower than that, you're going to struggle a bit more. But once you go back to pulling from the floor, it's going to be quite a bit easier, because it's like, hey, I'm not in such a disadvantageous position. It's a lot better of a position than a deficit. Then also just practicing more so the first part of the lift. And so something like halting deadlifts, which is where you would do half a rep up to your knees, drop the bar back down, not drop it, but go through the eccentric, and then do a full rep. And so that way we get half a rep in to practice at the initial phase of the lift, and then we get a full rep in. And so that'll just help us with a bit more practice. So that kind of covers off the floor weakness. And so now let's look at weakness at lockout. And first thing I want to touch on is block pulls. Now, some people like to prescribe block pulls, but I don't necessarily think that's going to be the best thing for struggling at lockout. Now, obviously, if you get stronger in a variation of the movement, like block pulls or deficits or whatever, you'll probably get stronger at the main lift, which is just the standard deadlift. So that's something important to note, is that no matter what, you can always get stronger at accessory movements, variation movements, and then that strength will have a good carryover to your main movement. But personally, when I struggle at lockout, it's because I'm fatigued, right? So it's going to be in the later parts of my set. And so for me, and this is something I heard Jeremy Hamilton say, the couch, and he said he would prescribe deficit pulls. And it makes a bit more sense, because if we're struggling at lockout, like I said, for me it's more so of a fatigue thing, so we kind of want to build up our work capacity in a way, and do that by doing deficits, by putting ourselves in a disadvantageous position. Whereas block pulls are an easier position for us to pull from. It's going to be a bit easier to overload and do better, right? We're in a good position there, versus a deficit deadlift where we're not in a good position. We have to pull the bar a hell of a lot further than in a block pull. I think that'll just transfer over well. But the key difference here is if you're failing at lockout because of fatigue, or if you're failing at lockout because of like weak glutes or something. And so that gets to my next point, is that, you know, do a lot of glute work. You know, we should definitely be doing a lot of glute work if we're struggling. We should just be doing a lot of glute work anyways, but especially if we're struggling at the lockout for deadlift, we should be doing glute work. So hip thrusts, yeah, I would just say do some hip thrusts. Another area we want to look at is our upper back, and so we want upper back work because that'll help with a bit with thoracic extension. And so doing this, because through the movement, if our shoulders cave forward and our upper back caves, it's going to make it a hell of a lot harder to lock out. So we want to be able to keep our shoulder blades back and down throughout the entire movement. And so just regular like upper back works, things like barbell rows, cable rows, whatever you can do, but make sure you keep your elbow a bit higher. If your elbow comes a bit more in like this, that's going to be a bit more lat focused. So elbow's a bit higher, bit straight back, really squeeze the scapula. And rack pulls can also help with that to a certain extent. You know, if we're struggling, you know, with our traps and keeping our upper back and not rounding forward, you know, doing something like rack pulls can really benefit us. So that kind of covers strength at lockout. Another thing would be band work. And these are all things that make the lifts harder, like band work, because obviously with band work for me, the hardest part is obviously at the lockout. And so I felt that's benefited me when I've done it. I haven't done a lot of band work, to be honest, just because I don't think I've had to. But I know that I've struggled the most with band work at the very lockout. And so, you know, if you get good at band work and then you go to not having bands on, it's going to be a hell of a lot easier to lock out, right? And so that's kind of the main thought process here, is working on our weaknesses by kind of making the lift harder, right? And so by getting better at a lift that's harder, we can get better at the main movement and kind of correct some of our weaknesses. And so another random tidbit is that if you're struggling because the bar is getting away from you, like if you film yourself and you're going through the lift, but the bar is drifting out in front of you, that's probably a sign that you need to do some, not necessarily lat work, but you need to work on being able to keep your lats nice and tight throughout the entire movement. And so there's plenty of things you can do there. Is one, do lat work, get stronger lats, and then also Chris Bridgeford showed me this, is you can put a band around a post or something right here and then hook it up to a barbell. So you put the two ends around a barbell or a PVC pipe or something like that. Then you yourself in a deadlift position, you'll pull the bar out to where you have tension with the band. And so what that's going to do is that band is going to be pulling on the barbell that you're holding, and that's going to make you really keep that barbell close to you, and it's really going to train you to use your lats effectively. So that's a little drill you can do if the bar's, you know, getting out in front of you. Okay, that wraps up this video. Next video is probably going to be about bench, so we're going to cover bench weaknesses next video. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you guys later.